Hey guys, tonight we're easing into something a little heavy. Picture a pair of massive gleaming jumbo jets, the pinnacle of 1970s engineering, sitting on a foggy tarmac. They are impossibly large, filled with people ready for sunshine, or ready to go home. But the air is thick, not just with fog, but with pressure, with fatigue, and with a fatal misunderstanding that is about to unspool. This is one of those stories where every single piece of Swiss cheese lines up perfectly, and let's just say, your luggage probably won't survive this. It's a story about how thin the veil is between a routine day and the unthinkable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always nice to know you're out there, and while you're at it, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from as the world turns. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It is Sunday, March 27th, 1977, and the Canary Islands are drunk on sunshine. This Spanish archipelago scattered off the northwest coast of Africa is Europe's warm, sandy escape hatch. For the sun-starved Dutch, Germans and Americans, it is the destination. And the main gateway, the beating heart of this tourist machine, is Gran Canaria Airport. Its airport code, which you'll want to remember, is LPA. On this particular Sunday, LPA is bustling. The air smells of kerosene, hot asphalt, and the faint, salty promise of the Atlantic. Charter flights are stacked in the sky, arriving and departing in a steady, profitable rhythm. It's noisy, it's a little chaotic, but it's normal. It is, until 1:15 p.m. Inside the terminal in the public concourse, a bomb hidden in a florist shop explodes. The blast is sharp, violent. It shatters glass, rips through unsecured panels, and sends a wave of concussive panic through the crowd. 8 people are injured, none fatally, but the message is clear. This isn't an accident. This is terror. The phone rings. A man's voice, claiming to represent the Movimiento para la Autodeterminación y Independencia del Archipiélago Canario, or MPAIAC, takes credit. It's a separatist group, one of many small, angry factions rattling around in the wake of General Franco's death 2 years prior. This is the era of the Spanish transition, a fragile, limping walk towards democracy, and the entire nation is holding its breath, waiting to see if it will succeed or collapse back into autocracy. It's a well-known historical fact that this period was rife with political violence, from Basque separatists in the north to simmering tensions right here in the Canaries. But the MPAIAC was, to be frank, a bit of a strange outfit. Here's a quirky little tidbit for you. The group's founder and leader, a man named Antonio Cubillo, wasn't even in the Canary Islands. He was running the entire independence movement from a radio studio in Algiers, Algeria, broadcasting revolutionary propaganda over the airwaves. He was, for the most part, considered a fringe player, more of a nuisance than a genuine threat. Until today. The voice on the phone isn't finished. He warns the Guardia Civil that a second bomb is planted somewhere else in the terminal. This changes everything. The first bomb was a statement. The second threat is a tactical nightmare. The Spanish authorities, already on edge from the political instability of the mainland, are faced with a terrifying choice. Do they call his bluff, search the airport while it operates and risk a massacre? Or do they shut it all down? They shut it all down. Immediately, Gran Canaria Airport is closed. All air traffic, incoming and outgoing, is halted. The terminal is evacuated. Bomb squads, dogs and nervous police officers begin a desperate, methodical sweep of every lounge, every bathroom, every forgotten suitcase. Out on the aprons, pilots who have just landed are told to stay put, their passengers stewing in their seats. And up in the sky, the real problem is just beginning. A stream of heavy aircraft, full of fuel and holidaymakers, are on their final approach to LPA. They include a KLM Boeing 747, Flight 4805, inbound from Amsterdam. Behind it, a Pan Am Boeing 747, Flight 1736, operating as a charter from Los Angeles via New York. These are not small planes. These are the jumbo jets, the queens of the sky, the largest commercial aircraft in the world. They are 400 tons of metal and dreams, and they suddenly have nowhere to land. The air traffic controllers at LPA, now working under immense stress, look at their maps. They need a diversion airport, and they need one now. The choice is obvious, if not ideal. Just 50 nautical miles away is the neighbouring island, Tenerife. Tenerife has an airport. Of course it does. But it's not the big modern facility that will one day be built in the south. No, this is Los Rodeos, a regional airport tucked into a valley in the north of the island. It's old, it's small, it has one main runway, and a parallel taxiway that is, unfortunately, not quite parallel and not quite long enough. Its controllers are used to handling inter-island prop planes and the occasional DC-8. They are not, by any stretch of the imagination, equipped for an armada of international heavy jets. Analysts and aviation historians still debate the decision-making process of that day. Was diverting everyone to Los Rodeos truly the only option? Couldn't the heavier jets have been sent back to the mainland, or to other islands with more robust facilities? But the chain of command was rigid. The threat was active, and Los Rodeos was there. It was the path of least resistance. In the cockpit of the KLM 747, the message comes through. Diversion. Turn towards Tenerife. The pilots sigh. It's an annoyance. A delay. Their duty time, the legal limit on how long they can fly, is already ticking in the back of their minds. In the cockpit of the Pan Am 747, the crew, already weary from their transatlantic hop, groan. Tenerife. An unscheduled stop. More paperwork. More time on the ground. Passengers will complain. Such is the life. Down in the cabins, the announcements are made. A minor security issue at Las Palmas. A short delay in Tenerife. Passengers settle back. Maybe they'll get a free drink out of it. It's just an inconvenience. No one is sacred. No one is panicked. No one knows that Antonio Cubillo, broadcasting from his studio in Algiers, has just sealed their fate. The closure of Gran Canaria, a decision made in a moment of justified panic, has just loaded the gun. The diversion to a tiny, fog-prone regional airport that wasn't ready for them is the first click of the hammer. The sky above the Canaries is now full of massive, graceful birds, all being funneled into a single, tiny and fatally flawed cage. The air traffic controllers at Tenerife's Los Rodeos airport were having a very normal, very quiet Sunday. Their airspace, a sleepy sector in the mid-Atlantic, was usually punctuated by the gentle buzz of inter-island flights, maybe a charter from mainland Spain. Their main runway, runway 1230, sat on a high plateau, 2,077 feet above the sea. This elevation was key. It meant the airport lived in a strange atmospheric boundary layer, often pierced by cool, wet winds pushed up the slopes of the massive El Teide volcano, the Panza de Burro, or Donkey's Belly as the locals called the persistent cloud layer. It was an airport known for its character. Then, the radio cracked to life, and it didn't stop. Gran Canaria was closed, a bomb, a second bomb threat, and everyone was coming to them. It started as a single blip, a request for diversion, then another, and another. The controllers, peering out their tower windows at their modest, quiet airport, must have felt a cold knot of dread. This wasn't a diversion. It was an invasion. First came the medium-haul jets, the DC-8s, the 727s, the Tridents. They landed one after another, the scream of their reverse thrusters echoing oddly in the high, thin air. The controllers, juggling radio calls and flight strips, began the agonizing puzzle of parking them. Los Rodeos had one main apron, the parking area by the small terminal. It filled up in minutes. The smaller jets were tucked into corners, wingtip to wingtip like sardines in a can that was already too small. Then, the giants arrived. The KLM 747, Rhine, was a majestic, terrifying sight, its blue and white tail fin seeming to scrape the low clouds as it descended. It landed smoothly. The controllers had a problem. Where do you put a 747? There was no gate for it. There was no parking spot designed for a machine this vast. The only place with enough concrete was the parallel taxiway. This is a good time to talk about the layout of Los Rodeos. Imagine a single, long strip of asphalt, runway 1230. Running mostly parallel to it is a single taxiway. This taxiway is the main artery, the service road that planes use to get to and from the runway without, being on the runway itself. But at Los Rodeos, this taxiway was also the main parking overflow, The controllers directed the KLM Jumbo onto this parallel taxiway and told it to park, facing the end of the runway. Then came a Sat Sterling DC-8. It parked behind the KLM, then a Braathens 737 which parked behind the DC-8. And then the radio crackled again. Pan Am 1736, the Clipper Victor, was on final approach. Another 747. This was the aviation equivalent of a clown car, except the clowns were 400-ton metal behemoths. The car was a regional airport and nobody was laughing. The controllers, now sweating, directed the Pan Am 747 to also enter the parallel taxiway and park behind the other parked aircraft. The Clipper Victor trundled into position, its massive, frame settling behind the Braathens 737, which was behind the Sat DC-8, which was behind the KLM 747. The trap was now set. The airport was officially, catastrophically full. The parallel taxiway was no longer a taxiway, it was a parking lot. It was completely and utterly blocked. This created a logistical nightmare that is difficult to overstate. It's a historical fact that in 1977, air traffic control, especially at a regional airport like this, was heavily reliant on visual confirmation and voice reporting. Los Rodeos did not have sophisticated surface movement radar that would show a controller every plane on the ground. They had ground radar, but it was basic. For the most part, they had to look out the window, and even if they could see, the system was now broken. With the parallel taxiway blocked, there was now only one way for an aircraft to get to the end of runway 30 for takeoff. They would have to backtrack. This means they would taxi down the actual active runway in the wrong direction, all the way to the end, do a 180-degree turn, and then be in position to take off. This is a procedure that is not ideal, it's slow, it's risky. It means an active runway is occupied for a very, very long time, and it relies absolutely on everyone knowing exactly where everyone else is. Meanwhile, inside the hot, cramped cabins, passengers were restless. The short delay was turning into an ordeal. The air conditioning was off, the air was stale, people were thirsty, children were crying. The crews, both in the cabin and the cockpit, were trying to placate them, but they were trapped too. And here's a little-known tidbit. The Pan Am crew, in particular, was vocal about their frustration. They had a massive fuel reserve. They had circled over Gran Canaria, waiting for it to reopen, until they were ordered to divert to Tenerife by Spanish air traffic control. They even radioed their preference to divert to Las Palmas in their company frequency, but the request was denied. They felt, with some justification, that they shouldn't even be here. They were now parked in a long line of planes with no clear idea of when they could leave, on an island they never intended to visit. The controllers in the tower were now managing a crisis they had never been trained for. The air was thick with radio chatter, not just from the planes on the ground, but from more planes in the sky, still trying to find a place to land. Aviation experts still debate whether the Spanish military, which managed the airspace, should have ever allowed this mass diversion, knowing full well the limited capacity and notorious weather of Los Rodeos. But the decision was made. The planes were here. The airport was saturated. It was choking on metal. The main artery for all ground movement was completely blocked by the very aircraft that needed it. All it would take to turn this massive, stressful inconvenience into a catastrophe was one more element, one more piece of bad luck. And as the afternoon light began to fade, that final element began to creep in. Up the slopes of the volcano, a silent grey blanket of cloud was rolling, a thick, wet fog that the locals knew all too well. The Sopa de Nubes was coming, and it was about to make the controllers and the pilots completely blind. The Sopa de Nubes did not roll in gently. It arrived like a wet, grey freight train. For the controllers in the tower at Los Rodeos, the view vanished not in degrees, but in an instant. One moment, they could just make out the massive, elegant tail fins of the two 747s, the blue of the KLM and the red and blue cheat line of the Pan Am, sitting awkwardly on their taxiway. The next, a wall of white. It was as if someone had thrown a thick, damp blanket over the entire airfield. This was not your average wispy morning mist. This was the notorious Canary Islands fog, born from the cold Atlantic currents meeting the warm African winds, forced 2,000 feet up the side of a volcano. It was less a fog and more a low stationary cloud, dense, opaque, and cold. Visibility, the most crucial metric in aviation, plummeted. It went from a few miles to a few hundred meters, and then, in patches, to almost nothing. The The controllers were now effectively blind. It's a well-known historical fact that Los Rodeos' high elevation made it infamous for these sudden, blinding fogs. But being infamous for it and being prepared for it are two very different things. The airport was not equipped with surface movement radar, the sophisticated system that allows controllers to see planes on the ground as little, glowing blips, like a video game. Their radar was for the air, not the ground. Once a plane landed and exited the runway, it effectively vanished into a mess of concrete they could only see by, well, looking. Now, they couldn't look. All they had were their radios, their headsets crackling with static, and the little paper flight strips that represented hundreds of human lives. They were, in essence, playing a game of battleship, trying to move colossal metal pieces around a board they couldn't see. This is where the true, fatal flaw of Los Rodeos snapped into focus. Remember that blocked parallel taxiway? It meant that the only path to the end of runway 30, the active takeoff runway, was down runway 30 itself. This procedure, known as a backtrack, was already a nuisance in clear weather. In this fog, it was a terrifying proposition. It meant the controllers would have to give a 747, a plane the length of a city block, permission to enter an active runway and taxi for 2 miles down its length, hoping, praying that nothing else was on it. It was like sending someone to cross a 6-lane highway, blindfolded, and just hoping for the best. The tension in the tower was palpable. The Spanish controllers, their voices strained, were juggling a dozen calls at once. English was the official language of aviation, but this was Tenerife English. It was accented, clipped, and battling against the static of high-frequency radio. In the cockpits, the crews spoke Amsterdam English and New York English. The potential for a simple, devastating misunderstanding was now astronomically high. This airport was never, ever designed for this. And here's a quirky little tidbit for you. The airfield's original name, Los Rodeos, literally translates to the roundup, because that's what the land was used for. It was a flat pasture where local ranchers rounded up their cattle. It was chosen not for its meteorological stability, but because it was a rare, flattish piece of land on a mountainous island. They were trying to land the most advanced aircraft in the world on a fog-shrouded cow pasture. Inside the cabins, the mood had soured completely. The air was thick and stale. The passengers, who had been patient for the first hour, were now openly complaining. The short diversion had turned into an indefinite claustrophobic trap. They were sealed inside a metal tube parked on a tarmac they couldn't see, on an island they never intended to visit. And then, just as the situation seemed like it couldn't get any more tense, a new piece of information crackled over the radio. Gran Canaria was reopening. The bomb squads had swept the terminal. The second bomb, the one the MPAC had warned about, was never found. It was a hoax, a bluff. The main airport, the one everyone had been trying to get to all along, was back in business. This news, which should have been a relief, was instead a lighted match tossed into a room full of gasoline. Suddenly, everyone wanted to leave, and they wanted to leave now. The simmering impatience of the pilots, who were all watching their duty-hour clocks tick relentlessly towards their legal limits, boiled over. The controllers in the tower, already overwhelmed, were now inundated with a chorus of requesting taxi, requesting clearance. What's our sequence? The pressure was immense. The traffic jam from hell needed to be undone. But how? The KLM was first in line, blocking everyone. It would have to go first. But to go, it had to taxi onto the active runway, backtrack 2 miles in the fog, perform a 180-degree turn known as a procedure turn, and then hold for takeoff clearance. Only after it was safely in the air could the next plane, the Pan Am, even think about doing the same. Aviation safety analysts still debate whether the Spanish controllers, overwhelmed by the sudden traffic and the blinding fog, should have simply frozen all ground movement. They could have declared the airport zero visibility, shut down all operations, and forced everyone to just sit and wait, perhaps for hours, until the Sopa de Nubes cleared. But the pressure from the airlines, the pilots, and their own superiors to clear the airport was enormous. The airport was a blockage in the global air network, and every minute it stayed clogged cost thousands of dollars. So they did not freeze. They decided to play the game. They would try to get these elephants blindfolded out of the hallway. The controllers looked at their paper strips. The KLM, Flight 4805, was first. They picked up their microphone. The first chess piece was about to be moved. The entire, fragile, jury-rigged system now depended on perfect communication, perfect adherence to a complex and dangerous procedure, and the flawed, fatigued judgment of the human beings in the hot seats. The first aircraft in that long, miserable conga line of parked jets, the one plugging the drain for everyone else, was KLM Flight 4805. Inside its cockpit, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of fog, a palpable, simmering impatience. And in the left seat, the man in command was Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten. Van Zanten was not just a pilot. In 1977, he was, quite literally, the pilot. At 50 years old, he was the chief of flight training for all Boeing 747s at KLM. He was the most senior instructor, the man who wrote the manuals, the man who tested the other captains. He was, to put it in modern terms, the final boss. When other 747 pilots had a question they couldn't answer, they were told to ask Jacob. He had over 11,700 flight hours and a reputation for being exacting, precise, and profoundly confident. But his importance went far beyond the cockpit. It's a well-known historical fact that Captain Van Zanten was a corporate icon for KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. He was the face of the company. If you'd opened a copy of Holland Herald, KLM's in-flight magazine, there was a very good chance you'd see his face. His distinguished salt and pepper hair, his chiseled, reassuring smile, and his crisp uniform were the centerpiece of a sprawling advertising campaign. The ads depicted him, often surrounded by smiling passengers under reassuring slogans. He was the image of Dutch reliability and calm professionalism. He was the guy who could make a mandatory pre-flight safety briefing sound like a velvet-voiced invitation to a very exclusive jazz club. He was Mr. KLM. This created a strange and dangerous irony. Because he was a high-level executive, a senior manager who spent most of his days in simulators, in classrooms, and in corporate meetings, he didn't actually fly the line very often. This flight to Gran Canaria was one of the routine trips he had to take to keep his license current. And for a man of his stature and his managerial mindset, this diversion to Tenerife was not just an inconvenience, it was a logistical apocalypse. The critical driving pressure was a set of regulations known as duty time. Dutch aviation law was, and still is, incredibly strict about how long a flight crew can be on duty. A clock that starts ticking the moment they check in at their home airport. In this case, Amsterdam's Schiphol. Van Zanten's crew was now approaching their limit. If they didn't get their plane back to Amsterdam before that clock ran out, they would be grounded. Out of hours! For Van Zanten, this was unthinkable. It meant stranding his 238 passengers, many of them Dutch holidaymakers. It meant finding hotel rooms for all of them, on an island that was now completely swamped with thousands of other diverted passengers. It meant KLM would have to cancel the plane's next flight, and the one after that. And, most humiliatingly, it would mean the airline would have to fly a fresh crew all the way from Amsterdam to Tenerife just to retrieve their flagship 747. It would be a financial disaster, a scheduling nightmare, and a massive public embarrassment for him, the star of the airline. He was not just a captain, he was the captain, with a capital C, and he had precisely zero time for this foggy regional airport nonsense. The cockpit of a 1970s airliner was not a democracy. It was a rigid hierarchy, and Van Zanten was at the absolute apex. His authority was total. In the right seat sat 32-year-old First Officer Klaas Meus. Meus was a competent pilot, but he was very much the junior. To make matters worse, this flight was a check ride for him. He was being evaluated by Van Zanten. Imagine having to take your final driving exam, but your examiner is the CEO of the entire department of motor vehicles, and he's tapping his pen on the dashboard while you're trying to parallel park a semi-truck in a blizzard. That was the kind of pressure Meus was under. His instinct would not be to question, but to obey. At the panel behind them sat flight engineer Willem Schroeder, 48, responsible for the 747's complex systems, the fuel, the electrics, the hydraulics. He too was subordinate to the captain. This cockpit dynamic is now famous, a textbook example of what safety experts call a steep authority gradient. Van Zanten didn't just lead his crew, he dominated them, perhaps without even intending to. His stress became their stress. His impatience became their shared mission. Aviation psychologists and safety experts still fiercely debate the exact nature of Van Zanten's mindset that afternoon. Was he a victim of get-home-itis, that dangerous tunnel vision focus on finishing a trip that has plagued pilots for a century? Or was it something more? Did his supreme confidence, his star power identity, make him cognitively inflexible? Did the man who was always the answer, the man who was always in charge, simply believe that he could will this situation to a close through sheer force of his own authority? The news that Gran Canaria had reopened only tightened the screws. The window was open. They had to go. He was the senior pilot on this entire godforsaken airfield. He would get his plane out. And here's a truly quirky and tragic tidbit for you. Captain Van Zanten was so intertwined with the image of KLM's safety and professionalism that when the airline's executives in Amsterdam were first informed of a catastrophic accident in Tenerife involving a KLM 747, their initial reaction was to try and contact Jacob Van Zanten to ask him to fly down and lead the company's investigation. It took several agonizing calls for them to finally understand that the man they wanted to send, their star pilot, was the one at the very centre of the disaster. But all that was hours away. For now, in the fog-bound cockpit, Captain Van Zanten was a man on a shrinking clock. He looked at the white abyss outside his window. He looked at his watch and he made a decision. He was going to start the process. He keyed his microphone, his voice cutting through the tower's static. He wanted to taxi. He wanted to get to the end of that runway. He wanted to go home. Parked in the queue behind the KLM 747, with a Norwegian 737 and a Danish DC-8 sandwiched between them, sat the Pan American 747, the Clipper Victor. If the mood in the KLM cockpit was one of high-strung managerial panic, the mood in the Pan Am cockpit was one of weary, profound exasperation. The crew of Pan Am 1736 was, to put it mildly, over it. In the left seat sat Captain Victor Grubbs, 57 years old. Grubbs was a Pan Am veteran, a senior captain with over 21,000 flight hours. He was a line pilot, a consummate professional who had flown just about everything, everywhere. He wasn't a corporate celebrity. He was a workhorse, and this was just supposed to be another long day at the office. In the right seat was First Officer Robert Bragg, 39, also a highly experienced pilot with nearly 11,000 hours. Behind them, at the systems panel, was Flight Engineer George Warnes, 48. This was a seasoned, competent and deeply tired crew. Their day hadn't started in Amsterdam. This was a long-haul charter. Their 380 passengers, most of them American retirees, had boarded at New York's JFK Airport, excited to start a 12-day Mediterranean cruise that was scheduled to depart from Gran Canaria. The crew itself was Los Angeles-based. They had already been on duty for a long time, and this diversion to Tenerife was the last thing any of them wanted. Their frustration was much deeper and much more justified than the KLM's. When the diversion order had come down from Spanish air traffic control, Captain Grubbs had looked at his fuel gauges. He had plenty of fuel. He could have easily circled in a holding pattern above the chaos for an hour, maybe more, and waited for Gran Canaria to reopen. He radioed this to the controllers. "We'd prefer to hold," he said, his voice calm, professional. The request was denied. Spanish ATC, in a decision that would be debated for decades, ordered him to land at Los Rodeos. So, unlike Van Zanten, who had to land for fuel, Grubbs was here against his will and against his better judgment. The entire Pan Am crew felt like they were in a meeting that absolutely could have been an email, and now they were trapped. Parked in a line they couldn't get out of, on an airport not equipped for them, in a fog that was getting thicker by the minute. Their passengers were getting restless. The cabin, with the air conditioning off, was stuffy and smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. This is a well-known historical fact. The Pan Am 747 Clipper Victor was a historic aircraft. It was Boeing 747 serial number 015, and on January 22, 1970, it had flown the first ever commercial 747 flight from New York to London. This was the plane that had inaugurated the jumbo jet age. It was a 380-ton piece of living history, and it was currently sitting in a foggy pasture, blocked by a 737. The crew was doing their best to manage the situation, and here's a quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit. With the passengers growing more and more agitated, Captain Grubbs actually opened the cabin doors and for a short time let passengers disembark onto the taxiway to stretch their legs. But as the fog rolled in and got colder, he called them back inside. Later, in an attempt to manage the growing claustrophobia, he and First Officer Bragg actually invited restless passengers up to the flight deck, a few at a time, to show them the cockpit, the instruments, and the almost comical white wall of fog just feet from their windows. This was, of course, a pre-9/11 world, but even then it was an unusual gesture, a sign of a captain trying to use a little human kindness to de-escalate a tense situation. Then, the news came that Gran Canaria was reopening. In the Pan Am cockpit, this was met with a sigh of, "Finally, let's go." Their impatience was not the frantic get-home-itis of Van Zanten, it was get to the hotel-itis. They just wanted to fly 50 miles, land, hand the plane over, and get to their crew hotel for a meal and a non-moving bed. But they couldn't. The KLM was in front. They listened on the radio as the KLM captain, his voice clipped and precise, began communicating with the tower. They could hear the impatience in his transmissions. This is where the dynamic became critical. The Pan Am crew, despite their frustration, was in a passive role. They had to wait for the KLM to move. Aviation analysts and human factors experts still debate the passivity of the Pan Am crew during this ground phase. Were they too tired to be more assertive? They knew the weather was degrading to almost zero. They knew backtracking on an active runway in this soup was dangerous. They could have been more forceful on the radio, perhaps suggesting to the tower that all ground movement should stop. But they were the visiting team. They were in Spanish airspace, at an unfamiliar airport, and they were, by nature and training, professionals who waited their turn. They were also deeply skeptical of the situation. The cockpit voice recorder captured their mood perfectly. At one point, as the fog thickened, one of them remarked with a dry, sleepy sarcasm, "This is a real pea-souper." They were also wary of the KLM crew. They could hear Van Zanten's hurried radio calls. At one point, they heard him tell the tower he was ready before he had even started moving. First Officer Bragg, listening in, remarked to his captain, "He's in a hurry, ain't he?" They were, in essence, the weary, sober observers to another man's building panic. They were the car stuck behind a guy at a red light who you just know is going to floor it the second the light turns green. They were tired, they were annoyed, and they were in precisely the wrong place, at precisely the wrong time, with precisely the wrong person in front of them. Their fate was now inextricably and invisibly linked to the man in the cockpit of the blue and white jet 1,000 meters ahead of them in the blinding fog. The news that Gran Canaria was open turned the quiet, passive tension at Los Rodeos into a frantic operational scramble. In the tower, the Spanish controllers, still blind, faced a puzzle that would have been complex in clear daylight. In this fog, it was a nightmare. The parallel taxiway, the airport's main artery, was a 747-sized and shaped blood clot. It was completely blocked. It's a well-known historical fact that this full blockage of the parallel taxiway meant there was one and only one path to the departure end of runway 30. This procedure was called the backtrack, or sometimes back taxi, and it's as clumsy and as dangerous as it sounds. Imagine your main residential street is a one-way road. Now imagine it's the middle of a blizzard, and you can't see the house across from you. A police officer comes to your door and tells you that to get to the end of the street, you must first drive your car, in reverse, the entire length of the street against traffic. Oh, and right behind you, your neighbour is going to be doing the same thing, also in reverse. This is what the controllers had to ask of the two largest passenger jets in the world. A runway is sacred ground. It is, by design, a sterile, one-way, high-speed corridor. The entire system of air safety is built on the idea that only one aircraft is on it at a time, and it's going in the right direction. The parking puzzle at Los Rodeos forced them to shatter that rule. The procedure would have to happen in sequence. First, the KLM, being first in line, would have to get clearance to taxi from its parking spot onto the active runway. It would then enter runway 30 and begin a long, slow journey down the runway, in the opposite direction of takeoff. It would travel for more than 2 miles, all the way to the very end, the threshold of runway 30. Once there, Captain Van Zanten would have to perform a complex 180-degree turn. This manoeuvre on a runway only 150 feet wide was a significant test of airmanship. Here's a quirky and very technical tidbit. A 747 has 18 wheels, and its main landing gear is a full 40 feet behind the cockpit. To make the 180-degree turn, the captain couldn't just turn the wheel. He had to drive the nose of the aircraft significantly off the paved runway onto the graded shoulder to pivot the plane's massive body. The main gear would trace a much tighter circle, its inner wheels barely scraping the edge of the asphalt. It was the aviation equivalent of parallel parking a blue whale, and he had to do it in zero visibility with his clock ticking. Only after completing this high-stakes pirouette would the KLM be in position, at the end of the runway, ready to hold for takeoff clearance. But this was only half the problem. What about the Pan Am? The tower, in its haste to clear the field, made a decision. They wouldn't wait for the KLM to finish this entire 15-minute process. They would try to do two things at once. They instructed the Pan Am Clipper Victor to follow the KLM onto the active runway. Captain Grubbs was to taxi down the runway behind the KLM, but only part way. He was supposed to look for a small angled taxiway called C3, or Charlie 3. This was a little exit ramp off the runway that would lead him back to the clear portion of the parallel taxiway. If he could find it, he could pull over and get off the runway, allowing the KLM to take off, and then he could follow behind them. So now we have the complete fatal picture. We have two 747s, invisible to the tower and invisible to each other, taxiing on the same active runway in a blinding fog. One is going all the way to the end to turn around. The other is following, supposedly to find a small, poorly marked exit ramp that the pilots had never seen before. Analysts and human factors experts still debate the tower's decision to have both aircraft on the runway simultaneously. Given the zero visibility and the non-standard high-risk backtrack procedure, many argue the only safe option was a one-at-a-time policy. The KLM backtracks, takes off, and is confirmed airborne before the Pan Am's wheels are even allowed to touch the runway. But the pressure to unclog the airport was immense. The controllers were overwhelmed, and so they sent these two metal giants, these two jumbo jets, fumbling down a concrete backstreet hoping they wouldn't, somehow, find each other in the mist. The stage was set, the pieces were in motion. The tower gave the first command. Captain Van Zanten, his jaw set, released the brakes. The Reen began to move. The passengers and crew had been sitting in their metal tubes for a long time, stewing in the stale air, when the news crackled through. Gran Canaria was reopening. A collective, weary sigh of relief. The ordeal was almost over. The pressure, which had been a low, dull ache, spiked into a sharp, urgent let's go. And then, as if summoned by some cruel, theatrical irony, the Sopa de Nubes chose that exact moment to descend. The cloud soup of Tenerife is not a gentle mist. It is not the soft, hazy fog of a London morning. It is a physical, tactile presence. It is a wet, grey monster that lives on the slopes of the El Teide volcano. It is a well-known meteorological fact that this phenomenon, known locally as the Panza de Burro, or donkey's belly, is a classic example of orographic lift. The prevailing trade winds, warm and saturated with moisture from the Atlantic, are forced to climb the massive 12,000-foot volcano. As the air rises, it cools rapidly, and its moisture condenses into a thick stationary cloud. Los Rodeos Airport, perched on its 2,000-foot high plateau, was built directly inside this cloud layer. The airport literally lives in the soup. For the people in the tower, the world simply ended. One moment, they could just make out the vague, colossal shapes of the parked jets, a smudge of blue, a smudge of red and white. The next, they were staring at a uniform, opaque wall of grey. It was as if someone had replaced their windows with wet concrete. Their ground radar, as we know, was non-existent. Their eyes, their primary tool, were now useless. The airport, from their perspective, was gone. It was just a map on their console, a crackle in their headsets, and a set of abstract problems. They were now managing ghosts. They were, in essence, playing a high-stakes, real-life game of battleship. KLM, are you at B4? Pan Am, have you passed C3? This blindness was terrifying, but the true, fatal nature of the Sopa de Nubes was its inconsistency. It wasn't a stable, uniform blanket. It was a roiling, chaotic mass. It moved in thick, wet waves like a tide. This meant visibility wasn't poor, it was variable, and it was variable from bad to zero. A pilot on one end of the runway might report seeing 3 runway lights, a distance of maybe 500 meters, but just 30 seconds later, a dense patch of fog would drift through, and he wouldn't be able to see the nose of his own aircraft. This created a deadly illusion of possibility, and here's a quirky, almost archaic tidbit for you. In 1977, measuring visibility wasn't always the high-tech laser beam RVR, runway visual range system we have today. At many airports, including regional ones like Los Rodeos, it was shockingly analog. It often involved a human observer sitting in a small shack near the runway who would literally count how many runway lights he could see with his own eyes. He would then phone this observation to the tower, who would relay it to the pilots. It was subjective, it was slow, and in patchy fog it was almost meaningless. The visibility at the tower was 0. The visibility at the Pan Am might be 300 meters. The visibility at the end of the runway where the KLM was heading was anyone's guess. Meteorologists and aviation historians still debate whether the tower's reported visibility was accurate or an optimistic, unhelpful average. The official report stated visibility was variable, at times as low as 100 meters. 100 meters. A 747 is 70 meters long. This means a pilot sitting in his cockpit might not even be able to see his own wingtips. Now, imagine the psychological effect of this. Inside the cockpit of the Pan Am, Captain Grubbs and his crew just sank. The cockpit voice recorder captures their weary resignation. The air is thick with sleepy sarcasm. "This is a real pea souper," one of them mutters. "I don't think we'll be going anywhere for a while." They were tired, they were professionals, and they were content to just sit. This was now, in their experienced view, an unliable situation. You wait. You just wait. The fog was a stop sign, but in the cockpit of the KLM, the fog was not a stop sign, it was a ticking clock. Captain Van Zanten, the star of the airline, was not a waiter. He was a doer. The fog was, to him, a physical grey obstacle that had just fallen between him and his escape. The news of Gran Canaria reopening wasn't a relief, it was a goad. The door was open, but now he couldn't see the hallway. His duty time was hemorrhaging. Every minute spent sitting in this soup, he was getting closer to the humiliation of being out of hours. He could hear the tower, their voices strained, trying to manage the unseen. He could hear the Pan Am sounding sleepy and passive, and he, the most senior 747 captain on the entire island, was stuck. The pressure was building in his chest. This fog was not just weather. It was a personal affront to his schedule, his authority, and his need to get home. The Sopa de Nubes had done more than just blind the airport. It had created two entirely different and fatally opposed realities. For the Pan Am crew, it was a logical, necessary pause. For the KLM captain, it was a rapidly closing window, a final, infuriating delay that was pushing his patience and his judgment past the breaking point. He looked at the white abyss. He looked at his fuel gauges. He looked at his watch. If he was going to be stuck here, fog-bound, he was not going to be stuck here and in Gran Canaria. He had to save time later to make up for the time he was losing now. The fog, the pressure, and his ticking duty clock all converged into a single, terrible idea. A decision that, in the moment, must have seemed perfectly logical, efficient even. A decision that would add another 30 to 40 minutes of stationary high-stakes waiting, trapping the Pan Am behind him, all while the Sopa de Nubes thickened from a soup into a cold, blind, suffocating chowder. The terrible idea that had formed in Captain Van Zanten's mind was born of a frantic, high-pressure managerial logic. He was a man with a schedule. The fog was a delay. His duty time was a fixed, non-negotiable wall. He could not control the fog. He could not control the tower. He could not control the Pan Am jet that was somewhere behind him, also waiting. But he could control his turnaround time at his final destination. His logic, in the confines of that cockpit, must have seemed impeccable. The flight from Tenerife to Gran Canaria was a tiny 20-minute hop. Once there, he would still have to fly all his passengers back to Amsterdam. That was a 4-hour flight, and for that, he would need a lot of fuel. Refueling a 747 isn't like filling up your car. It's a major operation involving high-pressure hoses, massive trucks, and a process that could easily take 30 or 40 minutes. He was sitting here anyway, wasn't he? Stuck. A sitting duck in the Sopa de Nubes. Why not save that 40-minute block of time? Why not refuel right here, right now? It was the 1970s aviation equivalent of deciding to defragment your entire hard drive just as your boss is yelling that the critical meeting is starting in the boardroom. It felt productive. Van Zanten keyed his microphone. His voice, crisp and professional, cut through the static, a sharp contrast to the weary, sarcastic drawl of the Pan Am crew. He called the tower. He wanted a fuel truck. This was, to put it mildly, a spectacularly bad idea. In the tower, the controllers, already at their breaking point, must have sighed with a profound sense of, "Are you kidding me?" They were trying to untangle the worst game of 8-bit flight simulator ever, and now the main player wanted to pause for a side quest. But this was Captain Van Zanten. He was the senior captain of the senior airline. A request from him was not really a request. They acknowledged they would find a fuel truck. A fuel truck at a regional airport isn't a magical summoned object. A human being had to get into it. That human being then had to drive in the same blinding fog across the unfamiliar jet-clogged apron, find the massive invisible KLM 747, and position himself under its colossal wing. This, in itself, was a new and dangerous operation, but the most immediate and most infuriating consequence of this decision was felt in the cockpit of the Clipper Victor. The Pan Am crew, Grubbs, Bragg, and Warnes, heard this transmission. The cockpit voice recorder, which had been capturing their sleepy, resigned banter, suddenly lit up with sharp, angry disbelief. He's going to refuel? God damn him! What's his problem? They knew exactly what this meant. A 747 being refueled is a grounded, immovable object. It has a massive truck under its wing, hoses connected and electricity flowing. It is, for all intents and purposes, chained to the concrete. And the parallel taxiway at Los Rodeos was not a 6-lane highway. It was a narrow service road. There was absolutely no way for the Pan Am 747 to go around. They couldn't squeeze past. They were, in a word, trapped. The KLM, which had merely been the car in front of them at the red light, had just put its car in park, turned off the engine, gotten out, and popped the hood to start an oil change. The Pan Am crew was now, officially, hostages to Van Zanten's duty time. Captain Grubbs, in a rare moment of open frustration, got on the radio to the KLM a direct cockpit-to-cockpit call. He wanted to know in no uncertain terms how long this was going to take. Van Zanten's reply was clipped. About 35 minutes. 35 minutes. A full 35-minute self-imposed delay while the fog got thicker. While the daylight, what little could pierce the Sopa de Nubes, began to fade. It's a well-known historical fact that Van Zanten's decision to refuel added 55 tons of fuel, over £121,000, to the KLM 747. This single act had two catastrophic consequences that Van Zanten, in his managerial haste, completely overlooked. First, the delay. The 35-minute window was 35 minutes where the fog, which was variable, could, and did, congeal from terrible to impossible. It was a gamble against the weather, and he was betting on the weather to wait for him. Second, and far more critical, was the wait. And here's a fascinating, tragic, and deeply technical tidbit. The flight from Tenerife to Gran Canaria was so short, the plane would have burned barely any fuel. By topping off in Tenerife, Van Zanten was loading his plane to its maximum structural weight for a long-haul flight, even though he was only planning a 20-minute hop. He was, in effect, making his plane as heavy and as sluggish as physically possible. A heavier plane is a less safe plane on takeoff. It needs more speed to get airborne, it needs more engine power, and crucially, it needs more runway. Van Zanten, in his desperate clock-beating attempt to save time, had just unknowingly and irrevocably stolen his own safety margin. He had added 55 tons of dead weight to his aircraft, right before he was going to attempt a high-risk, blind takeoff on a runway that was about to be famously, tragically, too short. Aviation psychologists and accident investigators still debate whether this decision was a product of get-home-itis or a symptom of managerial authority. Was he a pilot trying to save time or an executive optimizing a schedule, forgetting he was in a 400-ton machine? The Pan Am crew didn't care about the psychology. They just sat trapped and fuming, watching the little amber light of the fuel truck finally appear through the gloom, a tiny sulphurous star heralding another 35 minutes of captivity. The trap, which had been logistical, was now physical. The 35 agonizing minutes of the KLM's refueling finally, mercifully, came to an end. The fuel truck, a small blinking amber light, detached itself and was swallowed by the Sopa de Nubes. In the KLM cockpit, Captain Van Zanten's impatience was now a tangible, vibrating force. He was fueled, he was heavy, he was late. It was time to go. He received clearance from the tower to begin the backtrack. KLM 4805 is cleared to backtrack runway 30 and report ready for takeoff. He released the brakes. The Reen, now 55 tons heavier with fuel it didn't need for this leg of the journey, began its ponderous, ghostly journey. It moved from the parking area onto the main runway, its nose light cutting a pathetic, diffuse cone into the white wall of fog. It turned and began the long, slow 2-mile taxi down the runway, against the direction of takeoff, towards the end where it would perform its 180-degree turn. In the tower, the controllers, still blind, made their next move in this terrifying game of battleship. They had one piece moving. Now, to clear the board, they needed to move the second. They keyed their microphone. Pan Am 1736, taxi onto the runway, backtrack behind the KLM, and you were cleared to take the third exit on your left. In the Pan Am cockpit, this instruction was received with a weary, "Here we go." Captain Grubbs and his crew, who had just been held hostage for over half an hour, were finally on the move. But the instruction was weird. The third exit. First Officer Bragg pulled out the airport diagram, a small, flimsy piece of paper that was their only map in this grey, featureless world. In the dim, foggy light of the cockpit, they squinted at it. The airport had a series of small turn-offs that connected the main runway, where they were, to the parallel taxiway where they wanted to go. These were labelled unhelpfully C1, C2, C3, and C4. The controller had said the third exit. By a simple count, that was C3. Captain Grubbs, his 21,000 hours of experience screaming at him, looked at the diagram. Then he looked at the white void where a runway was supposed to be. It's a historical fact that the turn from runway 30 onto taxiway C3 was a 135-degree backward-angled turn. This wasn't a turn, this was a pivot. For a 747, a plane 230 feet long, to make this turn, Captain Grubbs would have had to do the impossible. He would have to taxi past the exit, slam on the brakes in the fog, and then somehow execute a 135-degree turn, perhaps even using his reverse thrusters. It was a manoeuvre that was, for all practical purposes, insane. The cockpit voice recorder captured their immediate, confused and fateful deliberation. "He said the third one," Bragg said, his voice laced with doubt. Grubbs, manoeuvring the massive jet onto the runway, replied, "I think he means the fourth one. That C3 is a 135-degree turn." "Yeah, I know. We'll take C4. That's a 45-degree turn. That's what we're built for." Their logic was sound. The tower must have meant C4. The controller, a Spaniard, had probably just miscounted. C4 was a gentle, 45-degree exit, designed precisely for a large aircraft to smoothly exit the runway. C3 was a glorified U-turn. So the Pan Am crew made a decision. They would ignore the third exit and look for the fourth exit, C4. This was the fatal, tragic misunderstanding. The Spanish controller in his regional tower wasn't looking at a diagram. He was just a guy who worked there. To him, C1 and C2 were just little stubs. C3 was the third usable exit. He meant C3. He said C3. Aviation safety experts and simulator engineers still debate, with almost frame-by-frame intensity, whether the C3 turn was impossible. Some very technical analyses, run in multi-million-dollar simulators, have suggested that if Captain Grubbs had begun the turn from the far side of the 150-foot wide runway, he might have been able to swing the nose just enough to make it. But this was a high-risk, non-standard manoeuvre that no pilot would ever attempt, without explicit clear-as-day instructions. Not in the fog, not on an active runway. So Captain Grubbs did what any sane pilot would do. He ignored the impossible instruction and proceeded with the logical one. The Clipper Victor was now taxiing slowly down the centerline of runway 30. Grubbs and Bragg were peering into the soup, their eyes straining. The fog was playing tricks on them, rolling in thick, dense patches. They passed C1. They passed C2. They could barely see them. They were looking for C3, if only to count it as they passed. Is this it? I don't think so. Just keep going. And here's a quirky, terrifying tidbit. The runway centerline lights, the little white lights embedded in the asphalt that are a pilot's only guide in low visibility, were broken. They were out of service. Captain Grubbs was driving a 400-ton, $80 million aircraft in a zero-visibility fog on an active runway, with no centerline lights to guide him, trying to count unmarked exits, all while another 747 was somewhere in the white abyss ahead, turning around. They were lost. They crept past the intersection for C3. Whether they missed it in the fog or had already decided to bypass it, the result was the same. The Clipper Victor was now definitively in the wrong place. It was in the no man's land between C3 and C4, still fully on the active runway, still crawling forward, searching for an exit that was now perilously close to the end where the KLM 747 was, at this very moment, finishing its turn. The tower at Los Rodeos was, by this point, a high-altitude pressure cooker. It was a small glass room, suspended 2,000 feet above the sea, filled with 3 Spanish men who were now staring at a solid white wall. Their entire world had been reduced to the crackle of a high-frequency radio. They were, in effect, playing a 3-dimensional chess game, on a board they could not see, with pieces they had never been trained to handle, in a language that was not their own. Their mental map, the one they were desperately trying to build based on static lace transmissions, looked something like this. Piece 1, KLM 4805. This piece was at the far end of the board. It had completed its long, blind backtrack. It was at this very second performing its 180-degree pivot turn. It was in position, or nearly in position, at the threshold of runway 30. Its next move was to hold, wait for clearance, and then take off. Piece 2, Pan Am 1736. This piece was the problem. It was supposed to be in motion following the KLM, but only part way. It was supposed to be looking for the third exit, C3. In the controllers' minds, the Pan Am was, at this very moment, in the process of turning off the runway. They were waiting, almost holding their breath, for the radio call, "Tower, Pan Am is clear of the runway." They were waiting, and waiting. This is where the tower's voice began to fatally break down. The fog in the tower was not just meteorological, it was linguistic. It is a well-known historical fact that the international language of aviation is English. This is a practical and vital safety rule. But this rule creates a world of Englishes. In that tower you had Spanish-accented English, a dialect often fast, rhythmic and prone to eliding certain consonants. In the KLM cockpit you had Dutch-accented English, which is more guttural, precise and can sound clipped or even harsh. In the Pan Am cockpit you had American-accented English, with its own drawls and idioms. Normally this is fine. Pilots and controllers are trained to use a specific sterile and limited set of words known as aviation phraseology. You don't say wait a sec, you say hold short. You don't say go for it, you say cleared for takeoff. But Los Rodeos was not a sterile environment. It was a crisis, and in a crisis everyone reverts to their instincts. The phraseology was breaking down. The most famous and most tragic example was the instruction to the Pan Am. Take the third exit on your left. As we know, the Pan Am crew in their cockpit were baffled. The third one? It seemed impossible. They decided the tower must have meant the logical 45-degree turn at C4. The controllers in their tower had no such nuance. They had an airport diagram, they pointed. Uno, dos, tres. C3. It was the third one. They said third. They meant third. They had given a clear instruction to them, and they assumed absolutely that it was being followed. Their mental picture. Pan Am is turning off at C3. The reality, Pan Am has missed C3 in the fog and is still on the runway searching for C4. The tower was now operating with a situational map that was 100% wrong. And here's a quirky and terrifying linguistic tidbit. The investigation after the crash focused intensely on the use of the word OK. In normal conversation, OK means yes or I agree. In the high-stakes world of aviation, it is a poison word. It is non-standard. The proper word to acknowledge a message is Roger, which simply means I have received your transmission. It does not mean yes. On that day, with the radios crackling and the pressure mounting, OK was being thrown around like a verbal tick. A pilot would say, "We are at takeoff," a non-standard ambiguous phrase, and the tower, instead of a crisp hold short, might reply with OK. That OK could be interpreted by a stressed, impatient pilot as "OK, I hear you," or fatally as "OK, you are cleared." The tower, for its part, was drowning in its own workload. They weren't just managing these two 747s, safety analysts still debate why the controllers allowed their attention to be so fatally divided. The other diverted jets, the 737 and the DC-8, were now also calling, asking for their taxi clearances. The controllers were trying to write down flight plans, issue routings, and manage the next 3 aircraft in the queue, all while the 2 most critical pieces on the board were invisible and in one case completely lost. Their voice was lost. They were communicating, but they were not connecting. They were sending out commands into a white void, and the replies they got back were just fuzzy enough, just ambiguous enough, to be painted onto their flawed mental map They believed the runway was about to be clear. They believed the KLM was waiting for their command. This assumption, born of fog, language barriers, and crushing, unbearable workload, was the final piece of Swiss cheese. The tower, the one place that was supposed to be in control, was now just a listener. They were about to become the unwilling audience to a sound they would never forget. At the far end of runway 30, the 180-degree turn was complete. The KLM 747 Reen was now a coiled spring. It sat perfectly aligned with the centre line, heavy with 55 tons of fuel it did not need, its nose pointing into an opaque white abyss. The 4 massive engines idled, their low rumble a stark contrast to the almost supernatural silence of the Sopa de Nubes. In the left seat, Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten was done. His patience eroded by the diversion, the delay, the fog, and the maddening tick of his duty clock was gone. He had refueled, he had backtracked, he had turned his ship around. In his mind, the only thing that stood between him and Amsterdam was this final, frustrating patch of fog. He turned to his first officer, Klaas Meurs. "Get the clearance," he ordered. "This is the moment. The final, critical, fatal misunderstanding." Muir, the 32-year-old pilot being tested by the airline's living legend, keyed his microphone. He called the tower. He requested his ATC clearance. It is a well-known historical fact that an ATC clearance and a takeoff clearance are two completely fundamentally different things. An ATC clearance is just your route. It's the set of instructions and radio beacons you will follow after you're airborne. It is the turn-by-turn directions for your flight plan. A takeoff clearance is the single, sacred, explicit permission to use the runway. You never move without it. The Spanish controller, his attention still split, picked up the request. He read back the KLM's flight route, a string of aviation jargon. KLM 4805, you're cleared to the Papa beacon. Climb and maintain flight level 90, right turn after takeoff. First Officer Meurs meticulously read the entire clearance back. This took several seconds. The controller, hearing the correct readback, said OK, then a fatal ambiguity. The controller, in his Spanish-accented English, added, "Stand by for takeoff clearance, I will call you." He knew the runway was not yet clear. In his mental map, the Pan Am was still taxiing, still looking for C3. He was telling the KLM to wait. But in the KLM cockpit, that stand by was either not heard or not processed. What Muir did next, under the crushing, silent pressure from his captain, was not in any flight manual. He unkeyed his mic, then immediately keyed it again. He said in his Dutch-accented English, "We are now at takeoff." This sentence is not aviation phraseology. It is nothing. It is a string of words invented on the spot. It's not requesting takeoff clearance, which is a question. It's not rolling, which is a statement of illegal action. It's an ambiguous hanging in the air announcement. We are now at takeoff. To Captain Van Zanten, in his state of hyper-focused, get-home-itis-fueled tunnel vision, it meant we are going. Before the controller could even respond to this bizarre, non-standard call, Van Zanten's hands moved from the yoke to the 4 massive throttle levers. He pushed them forward. "Let's go," he said, his voice a low final command. The 4 engines began to spool up. The low rumble became a vibration. The vibration became a deep, building, earth-shaking roar. The 400-ton jet, sluggish with its extra fuel, began to move. In the right seat, Klaas Meurs was suddenly horribly seized with a flash of doubt. He had the route, but he did not have the runway, and he thought he heard the tower say, "Stand by." He stammered, his voice suddenly small, a pathetic last-second challenge to the god in the left seat. Is he not clear? The Pan-American? Van Zanten, his eyes boring into the white void, his entire being focused on getting this metal beast airborne, did not even look at him. The engines were screaming. The jet was accelerating. "Oh, yes," he said, his voice flat, dismissive. "Joel." He was overriding his co-pilot's final timid check. Historians and human factors experts still debate whether Van Zanten's fatal "oh yes" was an honest, arrogant mistake, or a conscious, reckless rolling of the dice. A high-stakes gamble that the runway must be clear by now, just to shave those last few seconds off his delay. But the runway was not clear. A few thousand feet down that same runway, the crew of the Clipper Victor was still creeping along in the fog, lost, searching for the C4 exit. They heard the KLM's bizarre, We are now at takeoff transmission over their radio. Their blood turned to ice. "What's he doing?" First Officer Bragg yelled. "He's going!" Captain Grubbs shouted, panic flooding his voice for the first time. Grubbs grabbed his microphone. He jammed the talk button and screamed into it, his voice a desperate rising wail of pure terror. "No! We are still on the runway! Clipper 1736! He was shouting at the tower. He was shouting at the KLM. He was shouting at God. At that exact same split second, the tower controller, hearing the KLM's engines spooling up, also jammed his microphone to shout "Stand by." Two transmissions, the Pan Am's desperate "No" and the tower's urgent "Stand by" were sent at the same millisecond. In the KLM cockpit, all Van Zanten and Muir heard was a deafening 3-second squeal. That 3-second squeal was the sound of the universe's last desperate fire alarm being ripped off the wall. It was a heterodyne, a beat frequency. It is perhaps the most misunderstood and most critical 3-second sound in modern history. And it's a well-known historical fact that the cockpit voice recorder in the KLM jet captured it perfectly. A high-pitched, piercing electronic shriek like a badly tuned AM radio. It was not a glitch. It was a cold, hard law of physics. On an AM radio band, which is what all aviation used at the time, only one person can talk at a time. It's a simplex system. If two transmitters open their microphones on the exact same frequency, at the exact same millisecond, they don't just talk over each other. They don't merge. They annihilate each other. The two radio waves, the Pan Am's desperate "No" and the tower's urgent "Stand by," collided in the air. They mixed, they cancelled, they beat against each other, and they produced a third, new and utterly meaningless sound, a squeal. In the cockpit of the accelerating KLM 747, this 3-second sound was all they heard. Not the words, not the panic, just noise. And here's a quirky and deeply technical tidbit. The superheterodyne principle is, ironically, the very physics that allows a radio receiver to work in the first time. It's the process of mixing two frequencies to create a third, which is then amplified. It's the core of all modern radio. In this one tragic 1,000,000,000-to-1 moment, the very feature that allowed them to communicate was the exact thing that ensured their failure. The feature had become a catastrophic bug. Now, imagine the scene in the KLM cockpit. The four engines are at full, screaming takeoff power. The airframe is vibrating, the noise is immense. Captain Van Zanten is focused with a terrifying, white-hot intensity on the grey void in front of his window, his hands firm on the throttles. This 3-second squeal in his headset, if he even registered it, would have been dismissed as anything. A stuck mic, a common radio glitch, just static. It was an annoyance, not an alarm. Aviation safety analysts and human factors experts still debate, with chilling precision, what the KLM crew truly perceived in that moment. Did they hear the squeal and, in their state of tunnel-visioned get-home-itis, subconsciously dismiss it because it didn't fit their mental model? Their mental model was, the runway is clear. A squeal is just a squeal. It's not a 747. Or, in the sheer deafening roar of a takeoff roll, did they simply not hear it at all? Their brains filtering it out as irrelevant background noise? The CVR tape is haunting. First, you hear First Officer Muir's timid last-second doubt. Is he not clear? The Pan-American. Then, Van Zanten's godlike dismissive override. Oh, yes. Then, immediately the 3-second squeal. And in that 3-second window, the Pan Am's fate was sealed. The very last, desperate human cry for "stop" had been turned into meaningless electrons. Now let's jump to the other side of that squeal. In the cockpit of the Clipper Victor, Captain Grubbs has just dropped his microphone. He screamed his warning. He has done his part. He and First Officer Bragg are now, for a fraction of a second, frozen in a state of suspended terror, their ears straining. They're waiting for the roar of the KLM's engines, which they can hear somewhere in the fog, to suddenly change. They are waiting for the groaning, thunderous sound of reverse thrusters, the sound of an aborted takeoff. The roar does not change. It does not stop. It gets louder. They are lost in the fog on the wrong part of the runway. And the monster, deaf and blind, is coming. In the tower, the controller is now frantic. He heard the squeal too. He knows that's what happens when someone steps on a transmission. But who was it? And what did they say? "Pan Am, report clear of the runway," he shouts into his mic, his voice cracking. No reply. "KLM 4805, hold takeoff clearance." No reply. It's too late. The KLM is a sterile cockpit. On a takeoff roll, they are no longer listening to the tower. They are focused on their own internal life and death procedures. Van Zanten is, for all intents and purposes, gone. Back in the KLM, the jet is heavy, it's sluggish. That 55 tons of extra fuel, the fuel Van Zanten took on to save time, is now a 55-ton anchor. The plane is not accelerating as fast as it should. It's eating up the runway, every precious foot of concrete. Klaus Meurs, his one act of defiance over, is now a subordinate, dutifully calling out the numbers as the plane gains speed. 80 knots, V1, that is the decision speed. After V1, you are committed, you're taking off, there is no stopping. The squeal was the sound of the final door locking. The V1 call was the sound of the key breaking off in the lock, and in the Pan Am cockpit, Captain Grubbs, his eyes straining against the grey, suddenly sees it. Not a glow, not a distant light, but a wall of blinding white landing lights, exploding out of the Sopa de Nubes at an impossible speed. It is an apparition, a monster. It is a 400-ton jet, 150 yards away, and it is already lifting off the ground. In the cockpit of the Clipper Victor, the wall of landing lights was not an it was a who. It was the KLM, and it was not stopping. It was not on the ground. It was lifting off. It was a 400-ton monster, its nose pointed at the sky, coming at them at 150 knots. Captain Victor Grubbs did not brake. He did not freeze. He did what no 747 pilot is ever trained to do, because it is a useless, insane, and impossible maneuver. He tried to swerve. "Get off! Get off! Get off!" he bellowed, to his plane, to the fog, to the world. His hands, those of a 21,000-hour veteran, did the only thing they could. He slammed the 4 throttle levers to their firewalls, a desperate primal scream for maximum power. Simultaneously, he cranked the tiller, the small steering wheel that controls the nose gear, hard to the left. He was trying to power slide a 747. He was trying to drive a 380-ton, 230-foot-long building onto the grass in less than a second. The Clipper Victor groaned. The left side engine screamed, and the massive airframe began to lurch, to pivot, to crab walk left, its nose gear digging into the runway shoulder. It was the frantic, final, impossible movement of a cornered animal. In the cockpit of the Reen, Captain Van Zanten saw them. In that last horrifying fraction of a second, the grey fog parted, and the vague yellowish glow of the Pan Am's taxi lights, which he must have seen on the horizon, resolved. They resolved into the shape of another Boeing 747. A 747 sitting sideways, its massive blue and red tail fin, the iconic Pan Am globe filling his entire windshield. He too acted on pure animal instinct. He was already at V1. He was committed. He couldn't stop. He couldn't swerve. There was only one dimension left to him. Up. His hands, the hands of the star captain of KLM, hauled back on the yoke with a force that must have been bone-jarring. He was not taking off. He was trying to jump. And here is a quirky and brutal technical tidbit. In his violent, desperate attempt to leapfrog the Pan Am, Van Zanten pulled the nose up so sharply that the tail of his own aircraft, the last 60 feet of the fuselage, slammed back down onto the runway. The impact was recorded on the runway itself, a 64-foot-long, 2-inch deep gouge in the asphalt. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sound, a horrifying metallic scream. He was dragging his own tail in a shower of sparks to get his nose wheel off the ground. It wasn't enough. That 55 tons of extra, unneeded fuel, the fuel he had taken on to save time, was the anchor that sealed their fate. The plane was too heavy. It was too sluggish. It would not jump. For a single, silent, slow-motion heartbeat, the world held its breath. The KLM's nose gear did clear the Pan Am. It cleared the fuselage. Van Zanten almost made it. He almost, by a matter of inches, pulled off the most impossible feat of his career. But the main landing gear, the massive 16-wheel bogies under the centre of his plane, did not clear. They struck the Pan Am's fuselage just right of the upper deck hump, at over 150 miles per hour. The sound was not a crash, It was a shearing, a catastrophic metallic rip. The KLM's landing gear, like a set of industrial-strength can openers, tore the roof clean off the Pan Am's cabin. But the killing blow was the engines. The KLM's number 3 and 4 engines hanging under the right wing were the scythe. They ripped through the Pan Am's upper deck where the lounge and cockpit were, annihilating everything in their path. The Clipper Victor, its roof gone, its upper deck vaporized, was instantly, violently, deluged in a spray of its own fuel and the fuel from the now ruptured wing tanks of the KLM. It is a well-known historical fact that the impact was a glancing but utterly devastating blow. The KLM, mortally wounded, was now airborne. For a few seconds, it was a flying aircraft. The cockpit voice recorder captured Van Zanten's last desperate fight. The plane was dying, its main gear was gone, its right-wing engines were gone, its hydraulic lines were severed. He was at the controls of a 400-ton brick. The Ridge climbed to about 150 feet. It stalled, rolled violently to the right, and then, with all its 55 tons of extra fuel, it nosed over. It fell back to runway 30, about 1,500 feet past the point of impact. The plane did not crash. It detonated. It was an explosion of a magnitude that is difficult to comprehend. It was not a plane crash fire. It was a fuel-air bomb. The 121,000 pounds of kerosene, intended for the flight to Amsterdam, vaporized in a single silent white-hot flash. A fireball of almost 6,000 degrees erupted, a mushroom cloud of pure, bright orange flame that punched a hole in the Sopa de Nubes. In the tower, the controllers, blind and deaf, suddenly saw their entire world. The tarmac, the parked planes, the buildings, illuminated in a pulsating liquid orange glow, as if the sun had just been born on their runway. Everyone on board the KLM 40-5, 248 people, including Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, was gone. They were vaporized before the sound of the explosion even reached the tower. Back at the impact site, the shattered, roofless hulk of the Clipper Victor sat in the fog, drenched in burning fuel. The longest minute had just begun, and investigators and human factors experts still debate to this day the effect of Captain Grubb's final, desperate swerve. Did his attempt to get off the runway angle the plane in such a way that the KLM's engines missed the centre of the aircraft, saving the 61 people who would miraculously survive? Or did it present a flatter target, making the impact even worse? It was an impossible question, in a moment of impossible physics. The only thing that was certain was the orange glow of the fireball, illuminating the second, smaller and far more terrifying fire, now just beginning to take hold on the wreck of the Pan Am. For the survivors on the Pan Am, there was no sound of a crash. There was no time. There was only a sudden, violent and total violation. 1 second, they were passengers, strapped into their seats, their knuckles white, peering into the fog as their captain tried to swerve a 747. The next, the world was gone. The roof of the Clipper Victor was not torn. It was removed. It was peeled back from front to back by the KLM's landing gear and engines, as cleanly as a sardine can lid. The sky, a starless, foggy, dark grey, was now their ceiling. The cabin, which had been a sealed, pressurized, dimly lit tube, was suddenly an open-air convertible, exposed to the night, the cold, and the horrifying atomized spray of 10,000 gallons of jet fuel. The plane was dark. The impact had severed the electrical lines, plunging the cabin into a thick primal blackness, a blackness that was almost immediately lit by a new, hellish, orange light. The fuel which had drenched everything ignited. For the 61 people who would ultimately survive, this was not a disaster. It was a series of disjointed, personal, impossible moments. In the forward section of the plane, in the cockpit, the men who had just seen the monster coming were impossibly alive. Captain Victor Grubbs, First Officer Bragg and Flight Engineer George Warnes were still strapped to their seats, in a cockpit that was now gone. It had been sheared away. They were exposed, looking at a wall of fire that had been, a second ago, their first-class lounge. They unbuckled and, in a state of pure adrenaline-fueled shock, jumped from the ruined flight deck a drop of 30 feet onto the dark grass. In the main cabin, it was chaos. The plane had broken its back. The left wing, where Captain Grubbs had slammed the engines to full power, was mostly intact. The right wing, however, had taken a direct hit and was a roaring inferno. The survivors were almost exclusively on the left side of the aircraft. Their story is one of the most harrowing in aviation. They were alive, but they were trapped. The floor had collapsed. The exits were gone. The only way out was up through the non-existent roof, or down through the jagged torn holes in the fuselage. And then the center fuel tank of their own plane exploded. The explosion, a massive concussive whump, lifted the entire center section of the 747 and slammed it back down. This, tragically, killed many of the initial survivors who were still dazed and trapped in the wreckage. But for a few, it was a miracle. The force of the blast blew several passengers still strapped to their seats, clear of the inferno and onto the grass. This was not a rescue. This was a statistical anomaly. For the others, the only path was the one they made. It's a well-known historical fact that the jump from the Pan Am's left wing was a leap of 30 to 40 feet. Survivors, their clothes and hair soaked in jet fuel, their senses reeling, had to crawl over wreckage, find the intact portion of the left wing, and then, in the flickering, oily darkness, hurl themselves into an unseen abyss. They were jumping, hoping the ground was there, knowing that the fire was right behind them. They landed in the cold, wet grass, in the Sopa de Nubes. They were alive, they were in shock, and they were utterly, completely alone. The fog which had caused the accident now became the curtain for its horrifying aftermath. The survivors huddled together on the grass, 50, 100 yards from their burning plane. They were a pathetic, tiny group of soot-covered, fuel-soaked ghosts. They could hear the screams of those still inside. They could hear the thud of other survivors landing around them, and they could hear the other fire, the big one, the one that was illuminating the fog ceiling with that sick, pulsating orange glow. Here's a truly strange and tragic tidbit. The airport's fire chief, blinded by the fog, made a logical and fatal decision. He saw the massive fireball, the 6,000-degree inferno, 1,500 feet down the runway. That was the KLM. He drove all 3 of his fire trucks, his entire rescue fleet, straight to that fire. It was a hopeless, impossible task. The KLM wreck was not a rescue scene, it was a cremation. The fire was so hot the trucks couldn't get within 100 meters. They were spraying water on a nuclear core. For 18 agonizing, unforgivable minutes, no one even knew the Pan Am had been hit. The controllers in the tower, their windows glowing orange, assumed it was a single explosion. They assumed it was the KLM. They spent those 18 minutes frantically trying to account for the Clipper Victor, which had, in their minds, vanished. They were calling it on the radio, Pan Am 1736, report, Pan Am 1736, are you clear? Silence. The Pan Am survivors, 61 of them, were sitting in the wet grass, in the fog between the 2 fires. They watched in mute, shivering horror as their own plane, the Clipper Victor, began to die. The fire reached the other fuel tanks. A second massive explosion. A third. The plane was piece by piece tearing itself apart. Rescue services and aviation experts still debate whether the fog or the lack of a unified disaster plan at the regional airport was the primary cause of the delayed response to the Clipper Victor. Los Rodeos had never, in its wildest nightmares, planned for a 2-plane mass casualty event in zero visibility. They had no system. They had no surface radar. They had only their eyes, which were useless. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, one of the firefighters at the hopeless KLM blaze saw something. A flicker. A second fire farther down the runway, almost invisible in the soup. He went to investigate. He stumbled through the fog and the darkness, and he found them. A group of 60 people huddled, bleeding, burned, and staring at him as if he were an alien. He was the first rescuer to find the survivors of Pan Am 1736. He grabbed his radio, his voice breaking. "There is another one," he shouted, "another plane, and it is full of people." When the sun rose on Monday, March 28, 1977, the Sopa de Nubes finally, cruelly burned away. The bright, clear Canary Islands daylight revealed what the fog and the orange-black darkness had hidden. The site on runway 30 at Los Rodeos was not an accident scene. It was a battlefield. At one end lay the scorched black 64-foot-long scar where Van Zanten had dragged his tail. In the middle, the bisected, charred and unrecognizable wreckage of the Clipper Victor, its iconic blue and red cheat line melted into a puddle of slag, and 1,500 feet beyond that, the final resting place of the Reen, a vast grey-black patch of ash and atomized metal, the only recognizable piece of the entire 747 being a small section of its blue tail fin, a ghostly, silent testament. The investigation was immediate, and it was, to that point, the largest and most complex in aviation history. 3 nations were thrown into a tense, grieving collaboration. Spain as the site of the crash, the Netherlands as the home of KLM, and the United States as the home of Pan Am. The key to everything lay in 2 small, orange, heavily armoured boxes, the cockpit voice recorders, CVRs. They were flown to laboratories and analysed with a reverence usually reserved for religious artefacts. What they contained was, and remains, the single most harrowing and most important 30 minutes of audio in modern safety history. The Pan Am CVR was a recording of professionalism descending into terror. It captured the crew's weary frustration, their confusion over the third exit, and their final screaming realisation as the landing lights burst from the fog. But it was the KLM CVR that was the Rosetta Stone of the disaster. It was a perfect minute-by-minute portrait of a human mind coming undone under pressure. The impatience, the obsession with duty time, the clipped managerial orders, the fatal ambiguous "we are now at takeoff," the final timid challenge from First Officer Muirs, "Is he not clear?" the Pan American, and Captain Van Zanten's overriding godlike and utterly wrong, "Oh yes." The audio recorders from the tower were the final damning piece. When the engineers filtered out the 3-second squeal, that fatal heterodyne, they could hear, faintly, what the KLM crew never heard. On the tower's tape, you can just make out the Pan Am's desperate "No, we are still on the runway." It was the ghost in the machine. It is a well-known and defining historical fact that the Spanish investigation, in its final report, placed the primary and direct cause of the accident on Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten of KLM. He took off without a takeoff clearance. He failed to heed the tower's standby instruction. He overrode his own co-pilot's last-second, correct and vital challenge. The final death toll was 583 souls, all 248 on the KLM, 335 on the Pan Am, including 9 of the 16 crew members. 61 people, including the 3 men in the cockpit, had survived the impossible. Jumping from the inferno into the fog, it remains, to this day, the deadliest accident in the history of aviation. But the story of Tenerife did not end with the pointing of a finger. The investigators, for the first time, looked beyond the pilot error. They asked why. Why did a 12,000-hour star captain, the face of the airline, make such a fundamentally catastrophic error? Why did his 2 subordinate crew members, who knew he was wrong, sit silently by until it was too late? Investigators and human factors specialists still debate the precise weight of Captain Van Zanten's get-home-itis versus the steep authority gradient in his cockpit. But they all agreed on one thing. The system was broken. The 1970s cockpit was a kingdom, and the captain was its king. His word was law. His authority was absolute, and in Tenerife, that absolute authority was absolutely, fatally wrong. This disaster, in all its horror, became the single, bloody catalyst for the greatest revolution in aviation safety. It was the birth of Crew Resource Management, or CRM. CRM is a concept that was, at the time, heresy. It was a new training philosophy, pioneered by NASA, that deconstructed the idea of the God Captain. It mandated that a first officer's job was not just to fly the plane, but to challenge the captain. It taught flight engineers to speak up, and most importantly, it taught captains that it was their duty to listen, to solicit opinions, to create an atmosphere of flat, open, and vital communication. That timid "Is he not clear?" from Klaus Muirs, which was dismissed by Van Zanten, became the founding question of a new religion. Today, because of Tenerife, a first officer is required to say, "Captain, I am not comfortable with this. We must stop." And as for the quirky and final tidbit, Antonio Cubillo, the leader of the MEPIAC, the man whose phone call about a non-existent second bomb had started this entire lethal chain of events, was never charged. He continued broadcasting his revolutionary radio shows from Algiers for years. He survived a bizarre, bungled assassination attempt by Spanish Secret Service agents in 1978. After the political climate cooled, he eventually returned to the Canary Islands, not as a revolutionary, but as a lawyer, and died in 2012 a free man. The 583 lives lost in that longest minute were the terrible, almost biblical sacrifice that bought the safety of our modern skies. Every time you board a plane today, you're flying in an aircraft whose cockpit culture, whose very language, was forged in the fire and the fog of Los Rodeos. And now the runway is quiet. The fog, the Sopa de Nubes, still rolls up the Panza de Burro, the donkey's belly, and it still, on occasion, swallows the old airport in that high, lonely plateau. But the ghosts are perhaps a little quieter now. The lessons have been learned. The story has been told. The longest minute, that single, terrible, unspooling stretch of time has finally slowly come to a close. The metal has been cleared. The reports have been written. The 583 names have been carved into the memorials, and the world is, paradoxically, safer. The system was broken, and in its most violent, tragic and public failure, it was forced to be reborn. The sky did not get safer by chance. It was bought, and it was paid for, by the crews and the passengers of the Rhine and the Clipper Victor. So, as you let the last of this story fade, as you feel the weight of your own day begin to unspool, let that one, final, reassuring thought settle. The voices in the cockpit are different now. They're a team. They're a crew. They're trained to listen to one another. And they are trained, above all else, to wait for clearance. Dim the last of the light. Let the sounds of your own room, the soft hum of the fan, the quiet creak of the house, be the only thing you hear. Let the orange glow fade to a deep, comfortable black. Let the silence of that high, foggy mountain in the Atlantic just be.